For decades now, the biggest defender of Europe has been the United States. With over 40 military bases from Greenland to Turkey and approximately 84,000 troops, the US has been the main contributor to the continent's defensive shield. Throw in some of the most advanced weaponry in the world and you have a formidable military defense that's been around since the establishment of NATO in 1949. But all that has changed. For decades, the alliance between the US and its allies across the Atlantic Ocean seemed unbreakable, but with the arrival of Donald Trump back to the US presidency in January 2025, the unthinkable now seems likely. Europe may soon have to defend itself without the US. So how would Europe go about accomplishing this, and what might the consequences be? In this video, we'll explore how the EU and its European allies, including the UK, Norway, and Ukraine, can defend themselves without the support of the US. But first, just how substantial is the US military presence in Europe, and could the remaining NATO members make up the difference? In terms of both conventional and nuclear force, Trump is not mistaken when he says that the US shoulders the main burden of protecting Europe. As mentioned earlier, the US has a variety of bases strategically located across Europe, including the Air Force, Army, Navy, and nuclear forces. But it's not just the swathes of US military personnel with their own weaponry upon which Europe has come to rely. The US also supplies roughly 2/3 of all the military equipment used by Europe's own militaries. According to a report by former Italian Prime Minister and European Central Bank President Mario Draghi in 2024, between mid-2022 and mid-2023, 63% of all EU defense orders were placed with US companies. Europe has also been heavily reliant on US intelligence, particularly that which comes from the US's unparalleled high-altitude aviation and space surveillance systems. In terms of the war in Ukraine, as of early 2025, the US had contributed just over half of all the military aid provided to Ukraine since 2022, around $66.5 billion, compared to the combined European aid of around $62 billion. But even among that European contribution, a large proportion of it was in fact US-made weaponry and equipment. So it might not just be the US military presence on the continent that Europe will have to replace. It also might have to find a new source of weapons for its arsenals if Trump's military withdrawal from Europe extends to a moratorium on new weapons sales. This would present Europe with another smorgasbord of problems with regard to integrating these new weapons into its defense array and training its soldiers to use them. That said, it's unlikely that the US would simply refuse to supply multi-billion-dollar orders for military hardware from European nations. Indeed, some commentators have suggested that Trump's threats to withdraw from Europe may in fact primarily be a ploy to compel Europe to buy more US-made weapons. So for the purposes of this analysis, we'll assume that the US weapons will remain a significant component of Europe's defense setup, even without the US being actively involved. But how would Europe need to realign its military? What would it need, and how much would that cost? We'll unpack these issues shortly, but first, let's take a look at the threats Europe needs to defend itself against. The primary threat is, of course, Russia. NATO was originally established as a deterrence to the imperialistic Soviet Union and believes that under Vladimir Putin's leadership, its descendant, the Russian Federation, harbors the same imperial ambitions. Needless to say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has reinforced this belief somewhat. Europe fears that Russian President Vladimir Putin and the power bloc behind him also intend to invade parts of Europe to expand their territory and dominance. In the initial crosshairs are the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. These states were previously part of the Soviet Union and have bitter relations with Moscow. Their conquest would give Russia greater control over the Baltic Sea, strengthening its military position and restricting NATO access. It would also provide a key foothold for potential operations targeting Scandinavia, Poland, and even Germany, further destabilizing Europe's eastern flank. Another critical area for Europe's defense is Moldova, sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania. The conquest of Moldova would bring Russian forces to the banks of the Danube, threatening the main artery for Eastern European trade through the Black Sea, as well as major NATO military infrastructure in Romania. The Russia-aligned breakaway region of Transnistria, lying between Ukraine and Moldova, holds the biggest Soviet-era arms cache in Europe. Russia regards it as an area of critical importance to its national security, making Moldova a prime target for invasion and annexation. In order to launch a land invasion of Moldova, Russia would have to first conquer the heavily defended areas of southern Ukraine between Crimea and Transnistria, an invasion whose success is by no means assured. But Moldova is not a NATO or EU member state, and so does not enjoy the protection of their formidable defensive shield. That makes Moldova low-hanging fruit for a land-hungry Russian military. But Russia is not the only threat to European security. NATO has also defined China, Iran, and North Korea as threats, albeit much less significant than Russia at this point. The strategic partnership signed between Russia and China, Iran, and North Korea respectively since Russia's invasion, which include a substantial mutual defense commitment, have done little to assuage fears of potential threats emanating from these directions. Obviously, given the large distance between these secondary potential foes and European soil, Europe faces little threat of a land invasion from any of them. However, all three nations boast significant long-range missile arsenals that do pose a threat to Europe, along with significant capacity for cyber warfare and terrorism. And in the event of a major war breaking out between Russia and Europe, it's not inconceivable that we might see Chinese, DPRK, and/or Iranian boots on the ground fighting on the Russian side. Let's be clear, at present Russia does not have the armed forces necessary to conquer Europe, so any such contributions from its military partners would probably constitute a major escalation if it launched an invasion of Europe. More than half of Russia's armed forces, some 700,000 soldiers, are believed to be engaged in the war in Ukraine. Russia has more or less managed to transition to a war economy and ramp up production of critical military equipment like tanks, drones, artillery shells, and armored personnel carriers substantially. But it would need a mass mobilization of up to several million soldiers, then need to train them, plus a further massive upgrade in military production before it would be in a position to feasibly launch a large-scale, long-term attack on Europe. It's estimated that it might take anywhere from 3 to 10 years for them to reach this capacity. That gives Europe a small but workable window of opportunity to upgrade its defense without the US as a backstop. So what steps does Europe need to take now, how much will it cost, and where will the money come from? The priority is to continue providing major support to Ukraine, and there are two main reasons for this. First, if the entire territory of Ukraine were to fall into Russian hands, not only would Moldova be threatened, but Russia would be at the doorstep of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania, bringing its military presence dangerously close to the heart of Europe, including Germany. Russian missiles and long-distance drones would be within striking distance of major European cities, so Ukraine acts as the most important buffer between Europe and Russia. The second reason is Ukraine's army, estimated to be around 800,000 troops, with a high likelihood of further mobilization in the near future. Not only is this by far the largest force in Europe, but like the Russian military, most of it is battle-hardened after over 3 years of brutal, high-intensity, multifaceted warfare. This force would continue to provide a primary defense against any Russian invasion. Alternatively, there's a possibility that this force may become a threat to Europe. What happens to the Ukrainian army if Ukraine falls, or if it looks like the Ukrainian political establishment is being pressured by Western partners to sign an agreement to end the war, which is not to the Ukrainian military's liking? It's not inconceivable that this powerful military might revolt against its own political leadership and stage a coup, or seize a chunk of territory and declare a belligerent independence. Europe might be left with the two largest armies on the continent, Ukraine and Russia, hostile to it and each other, right on its doorstep. This makes for another compelling reason to ensure that Ukraine remains well within the European defense fold. But supporting Ukraine without US contributions, let alone bolstering the defenses of its other borders, will come at a massive cost for Europe. It's estimated that Ukraine would need in the region of 150,000 European troops to effectively fend off Russia, plus a continuous flow of equipment and high-end gear like air defense systems and long-range missiles. The bill wouldn't just be hundreds of millions, it would likely reach hundreds of billions annually. Just paying the salaries of 150,000 troops would cost billions, and supplying high-end equipment would push the cost even higher. A Bruegel report estimates Europe would need to increase defense spending by 250 billion euros per year to make up for the reduced US presence. But can Europe afford it? From a macroeconomic perspective, the numbers are small enough for Europe to replace the US fully. In 2024, US military support amounted to 20 billion euros out of a total of 42 billion euros, or 21.85 billion and 45.89 billion in US dollars respectively. To replace the US, the EU would thus have to spend only another 0.12% of its GDP, a feasible amount on the face of it. But digging a bit deeper, it gets more complicated. Those 150,000 troops plus equipment would need to be mobile enough to be rapidly redeployed if Russia attacks elsewhere, for example in the Baltic region. It probably therefore makes sense to have two such forces, totaling around 300,000 troops. Half will be deployed to Ukraine, and the rest strategically located near potential flashpoints like the Baltic states, maintained in a high state of readiness for action. The complication and organization of such a large contingent of pan-European troops presents issues of its own. Both the Russian and US militaries operate under a single, well-established chain of command, and everyone from 5-star generals to lowly grunts speaks one and the same language. In this respect, Europe suffers a huge disadvantage. Each European nation maintains its own military under its own chain of command, and there are a multitude of languages spoken across the continent, and sometimes even within the same nation. Although high levels of coordination and standardization have been accomplished under the auspices of NATO, the difficulties in merging such disparate forces with very different setups and cultures shouldn't be underestimated. Technically, there are around 1.47 million active duty servicemen across Europe, including the UK. However, whether it's even possible within a 3 to 10 year timeframe to construct a unified, formidable pan-European army capable of taking on Russia is an open question. Assembling the equipment that will be required by these troops is also not that simple. As mentioned earlier, it's unlikely that US military-industrial giants like Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics would willingly turn their noses up at huge, lucrative orders from Europe. Nevertheless, Europe will undoubtedly have to rapidly expand its own military production to a large extent in order to mount a credible deterrence to Russia, let alone China, Iran, and North Korea combined. According to a Bruegel analysis, just to prevent a Russian breakthrough in the Baltics would require a minimum of 1,400 tanks, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and 700 artillery pieces, including 155mm howitzers and multiple rocket launchers. This is more combat power than currently exists in the French, German, Italian, and British land forces combined. A 90-day defense of the Baltics alone would require around 1 million artillery shells. While Ukraine has received millions of shells through various initiatives, including a Czech-led effort, Europe has struggled to meet its own production goals. The EU's separate pledge to deliver 1 million shells in a year fell 8 months behind schedule, underscoring just how much ramping up production is still needed. And that's just one item of critical equipment. In terms of missiles, drones, tanks, armored vehicles, and assorted ammunition types, Russia's production already greatly exceeds that of the combined EU and is increasing at a greater rate all the time. Europe would also need to generate aviation, transport, communication, and intelligence capacities. All of this will cost a pretty penny, especially if a large proportion of purchases are from the US. A more prudent approach would be to procure as much as possible from European manufacturers. This strategy makes the most sense, both from the perspective of security and economics. In terms of security, recent revelations about the possible existence of kill switches in F-35 fighter jets supplied to European allies by the US highlight the risks of relying on foreign military equipment, and that's from Europe's most trusted ally for decades. These kinds of security risks are bound to increase if Europe procures more equipment from less trusted sources, like India or Israel. Financially, it also makes a lot more sense to procure as much as possible locally. To be sure, production would have to ramp up hugely, with non-military industry likely being co-opted into repurposing some of its capacity for military production. This could actually provide a much-needed boost to GDP and employment in the many European countries currently suffering from weak growth, high unemployment, and the rise in social discontent that inevitably accompanies economic hardship. It's likely that European manufacturers will be more than willing to get involved in ramped-up military production. In March 2025, Volkswagen announced that instead of shutting down struggling plants, it would consider converting them to produce military equipment rather than consumer vehicles. Given the growing demand for defense production in Europe, it's likely that other major industrial players will follow suit, eager to secure lucrative military contracts. Placing large, long-term orders for key equipment should also act to ultimately bring down the unit cost, which could save Europe tens of billions of dollars in its defense upgrade. In this respect, the longer the window of opportunity for Europe to rearm is open without being in a state of war, the better. While large orders to be delivered steadily over time will bring costs down, on the flip side, emergency orders for equipment required ASAP tend to raise the price considerably. The European Sky Shield Initiative, ESSI, is already a strong step towards strengthening Europe's air defense capabilities. Designed to integrate ground-based missile and air defense systems across 23 European nations, the initiative aims to provide a coordinated shield against aerial threats, including missile and drone attacks. So now we know what Europe needs to do, and we have an idea of the kind of financial commitment required. But where's the money going to come from? The Bruegel analysis suggests that European defense spending will have to increase substantially from current level of about 2% of GDP to around 3.5% in the short term. Trump has suggested 5%. With the right procurement strategies, such as the placing of large orders discussed earlier, the net cost could come down significantly, but it's still going to cost tens, if not hundreds, of billions annually. Right now, the only way Europe can raise these funds is through the issuance of fresh debt, both by the EU and individual states. This is a double-edged sword in both cases. On the one hand, there are compelling arguments that a debt-funded increase in defense spending should boost European economic activity at a time when external demand may be undermined by developing trade wars with the US and China and sluggish economic growth. While it's difficult to determine the precise effects, historically, defense spending also leads to technological innovations that boost productivity, ultimately reflected in the financial bottom line. On the other hand, increasing the debt substantially also acts to weaken economies by reducing bond yields and raising interest rates. It's debatable whether many of Europe's less affluent nations are in a position to take on these costs at all. For the prosperous European nations, these effects wouldn't have been such a problem a decade ago, but most European economies are not what they were pre-COVID. Lost revenues from European firms as a result of anti-Russian sanctions, and large increases in energy costs due to the switch from cheap, piped Russian gas to LNG imported by sea from the US and elsewhere, have damaged European competitiveness, contributing to an economic slowdown across most of the continent. Divisive elections during 2024 and 25 in France, Germany, Slovakia, and Moldova have revealed the growing influence of populist and anti-war parties, as well as increasing fragmentation among electorates. In the UK, while the ruling Conservative Party had previously embraced some populist rhetoric, their defeat marked a shift toward a more traditional, pro-European stance under Labour leadership. If European ruling parties continue on the path of militarization against the wishes of the people, especially if this is accompanied by cuts in social spending and welfare programs, the likelihood of mass social unrest and political upheaval will only increase. This is a risk not just internally within individual countries, but between the European nations themselves. Already, the likes of Hungary, Slovakia, and Ireland stand opposed to increased military buildup and want to pursue less aggressive strategies against Russia and China. With the divisions between these dissenting nations and the core pro-Ukraine nations seemingly on the rise, it's debatable whether Europe as a whole will even be able to physically implement a coordinated, unified defense against external threats like Russia or even the US. The alternative is for each nation to fend for itself, or other nations to bond into smaller alliances, which may be just as hostile to each other as to Russia. Certainly, on paper, no European power comes close to matching Russia or China's military might in terms of conventional military force. And that's before taking into account Russia's nuclear arsenal, which dwarfs Europe's combined capability at least tenfold. French President Emmanuel Macron's proposal to use French and British nuclear weapons to create a pan-European nuclear deterrence isn't all that intimidating when you consider that he's talking about a total of perhaps a couple of hundred nukes, up against Russia's estimated just below 6,000. All things considered, it's easy to understand why European leaders are scrambling to come to terms with the US's threats to withdraw its security umbrella. But it's not an insurmountable task to go it alone. Given the right strategies, popular support, and sufficient funding, it seems likely that Europe will be able to mount a credible defense within a 10-year timeframe. That's the timeframe suggested by the Bruegel analysis as the outer limit for when Russia might be ready to invade Europe. However, to achieve this within the 3-year lower limit Bruegel's analysis suggests looks unrealistic. There's just too much that needs to be considered, acted upon, and paid for. Perhaps, as distasteful as it may seem, the best option for Europe to comprehensively defend itself is going to be bending the knee to Trump and doing whatever he demands so that the US remains Europe's main defense shield. After all, there's nothing quite like the largest military in the world, backed by thousands of nukes in terms of deterrence. However, whether the compromises and costs demanded by Trump ultimately leave Europe more vulnerable than it would be by going it alone is another question entirely. But what do you think? Is Europe able to defend itself without the US? How do you think Europe should approach its defense? Please let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.